So it's a pleasure to see all the new faces, and thank you to those who endured this morning's session for coming back. This is actually, I wouldn't have said this morning, this is the more fun of the two presentations, at least in terms of where I'm at as a photographer. So again, my blog, speedlighting.com, there in the middle, spelled Canon's Way. My portfolio lurks over on sylarena.com. And of late, I have found that I can communicate the entire universe, at least almost everything that needs to be said in 140 characters or less on Twitter. So you can follow me on Twitter if you're so inclined. I want to take the advantage of this afternoon's session and start by brainwashing you. Is that okay? I want to share with you a handful of my philosophies about photography that I hold near and dear to my heart in terms of who I am as a photographer and how I approach this broad, vast enterprise of photography. So in the context of talking about lighting persona and creating cinematic light, I come at that concept by dividing the universe of photographers into two hemispheres, the documentarians and the pictorialists. And some of you may say, well, I routinely swing from one side to the other, and some of you may say, oh God, no, my absolute goal as a photographer is to craft an image that represents what I see in front of my lens. Well, if that's your vision, if that's your goal, if that's your journey as a photographer, to craft a photograph that represents what you see in front of the lens, then you're a documentarian. And I'm not saying right or wrong here. I'm just helping define different pursuits and different approaches to photography. I worked really, really hard for many, many years to become a really good documentarian of the world until I realized that those kind of photographs to me were really boring. Because I didn't go to war zones and I didn't go to places where there were exotic people staring back at me majestically. I was photographing the world around me. And if I photograph the world around me and it's my ordinary, mundane, humdrum world, and all I'm doing is making photographs that look like that boring, mundane, humdrum world, then I'm making boring, mundane, humdrum photographs. Until I show them to those exotic, majestic people on the other side of the world. And they go, oh my God, look at this photograph of this. Anyway. Then I began to embrace the idea of becoming a pictorialist. And what that really means is I have very little interest in making a photograph that represents the world as I see it. But I'm keenly interested in making photographs that represent the world as I want to see it. Or you can push that farther down the track and you can say, since I'm free to craft light, I can create the persona of the person in front of my lens. So think about where you are and what's of the greatest interest to you. This afternoon, we're going to focus on my pictorial approach to lighting. But I guarantee you, if you're a documentarian, if you're a photojournalist, all right, in the world, Lord knows, we still need great documentary photography. There are still things, I guarantee you, there are still things about my approach to lighting that will be of value to you. Now, I say this sincerely, and I also recognize that I'm saying it in the largest photo store in the world, all right? Nobody is going to remember you by the gear you used. I hope that I'm not remembered as a Canon photographer. I hope that I'm remembered as a photographer who made a handful of really amazing images. 20 years from now, nobody is truly going to care what gear you used, all right? And I've shot Canon for 30 plus years, and I think I'm finally getting to be pretty darn good at it, all right? But our images go out into the world without us, so don't get hung up on gear. There are many different ways to create the same kind of light. Don't feel like you have to go get one of everything I talk about today in order to begin your journey. My friend Zach Arias taught me a really important lesson with his one light philosophy. I'm trying to get Zach onto two light, but one light works. And I've made some of my strongest images using Zach's philosophy of get one piece of gear and learn to master that gear until you get another piece. Don't bankrupt yourself running down the path saying, if only I have this, if only, if only, if only. I went down that path and I nearly went broke. Zach did go broke, which is why he started a one light. This is so important to me, and it's so much about who I am. When I switched to digital photography about 7 or 8 years ago, I had been using Photoshop for years before that. I was a horticultural photographer in the 90s. My medium format images would be scanned for catalogs, and I would get those scans back, and we had to use Photoshop to do some basic changes. And then when I got into the world of digital photography, I realized that I could do all kinds of things in Photoshop that I never dreamt of doing when I was in film. And I say this quite sincerely, for many, many years, I spent most of my time driving a camera to the point where I really, or driving a computer, to the point where I really forgot how to drive a camera. And back in the film day, it was really easy for me to say, I'm a photographer and you're the scanner/retoucher for the printer. Now most of what I hand off to be printed, nobody else deals with until it gets put on the page to be printed. What this really means to me is that I will do anything I can before I push the shutter button to make the best capture I can. I want to minimize the amount of time I have to spend in post. And my friend Frederick Van Johnson, who I from time to time co-host This Week in Photo, a great podcast if you're not familiar with TWIP. Frederick has me on once a month or so, and he called me a traditionalist. And I said, Frederick, you know me, if anything, I'm not a traditionalist. He goes, no, man, you are really old school, a purist in your thought. And it took me aback, and I finally realized this is what he was talking about. In terms of saying, I don't want to light on a laptop like my friend Vinny Versace. Kudos to Vinny for understanding Photoshop that well, all right? But I'm a photographer, he's a retoucher. I'm not saying that's bad, but I implicitly choose to be a photographer, and I push myself to be the best dang photographer I can. And the good news is, I now suck at Photoshop, and I'm proud to say it. I promise you, if you learn to see light, I'm going to say it again, if you learn to see light, your photography is going to improve automatically. Now, I thought I knew a lot about light until maybe, 5, 6, 7 years ago when I really challenged myself to say, can I look at each one of your faces in this room and understand why the light is coming to my eye the way it is? Can I sense the changes throughout the day in the color temperature of the sun? Can I be sensitive to subtle shifts in color? And I would argue that most photographers think they're sensitive to light, when in fact they're really not. And I think, and I say this poetically, but I'm sincere, I think opening your heart to light and letting that light come inside and letting it move you and touch you, when that begins to happen, at least for me on my journey as a photographer, that's when I began to make some amazing images. It wasn't about chasing the light and saying, okay, what are these buttons and dials going to do in terms of getting what I see into here so I can get it over there? And half the time now when I see great sunsets, I don't even begin to reach for my camera because I know the camera is going to fall so far short of what I see. But the good news is, by enjoying what I see and knowing what a powerful sunset looks like, and what a rich, golden, warm sunset in my home of California feels like, I can now go out on location at any hour of the day or night, and I can create that light. So if you learn to craft light, you learn to shape it, you learn to direct it, you learn to color it. If you learn to craft light, you'll be able to really create the persona of the person in front of your camera. Okay? So I hope we get to a point where we deconstruct this image. Those of you who were here this morning are sworn to secrecy when we ask questions about how we created this image. If I were to ever have a gravestone, big if, not that I don't plan on dying someday, I just haven't scheduled it yet, this is what I would want it to say. To create interesting light, you have to create interesting shadows. So you need to look at the light and always think about the shadows. This is when this popped in my head, didn't pop all at once. I think it had to try to beat itself in many, many times before I finally embraced it. to me, this is really powerful. And we're going to talk about this realm of shadows. Because while I've gained a reputation as being somebody who teaches and knows a lot about lighting, let me suggest to you that it's really about shadowing. We can throw light at anything, but without shadows, and you'll see this in a bit, without shadows, we just have crappy light. So I'm going to take a look. I want you to take a look at my portfolio of work that I've done over the last year and a half. These are all portraits that I've lit actually with small flash. I shared with many friends recently, I know that I painted myself into the corner of being a small flash guy, and I'm comfortable wearing that yoke. But for 15 years before I worked a lot with small flash, I worked with big flash. So most of these images could have been crafted with big flash as well. Again, it doesn't really matter about the gear. What matters is the light. One thing I also believe very firmly in is that my photographs go out into the world without me. So we're going to take 6 or 8 seconds. We're going to look at each of these images or pairs of images and move on. I'm happy to answer every question I can for you today. But for the portfolio, I just want you guys to look at these images and get some references as to the type of work that I do. Okay? So now that you've seen a little bit of my work, you understand I'm not afraid of shadows. In fact, I really love shadows. And in a lot of my photographs, I look through my portfolio, and I think I love the shadowing more than the lighting in some instances. So if you have any question about that image, I'm more than happy to answer it. But let's see if I don't answer it along the way. And then when we come back to it as we're wrapping up, I'm happy to search back and put the images back on. So my approach to lighting, pictorial lighting, cinematic lighting. What I mean by cinematic is that, like a movie maker, I'm willing to do whatever's necessary to craft light, to create the persona, create the image of the person that I want to create. I'm not a documentarian. So my approach to lighting always begins with an understanding of what the ambient light is doing and how the camera is going to perceive it. So just to be sure we have a foundation of concepts, the ambient light is the light that's already there. In this room, that light blinding me is ambient light. We've got fluorescent coming in through the screens. All right, there's a little bit of light coming in through the stairwell. There's light bouncing off of the screen and lighting your faces for me. Those are all sources of ambient light. I settle on the exposure for the ambient light before I turn on my flash. Most people find that they turn everything on and then they start taking pictures and they don't know what to change. So you're going to see that I work through a series of steps And it always begins with understanding what the ambient light looks like to the camera. So here's a shot I did on a rooftop here in New York. All right? Shot with flash. In fact, if you look closely, you can see the shadow of the model on the brick wall. And that's the shot I was after. Also shot with flash. So what's the difference? The ambient didn't change. It's the same ambient light. Yeah. What did I do? What did I do? Exactly. Exactly. I changed the shutter speed. Shutter speed is the camera setting that you should use to control how the camera records ambient light. Okay? So there's the details. On the left, the shutter speed was 1/30th of a second. On the right, the shutter speed was 125th of a second. I encourage all my students, I don't want your heads to explode with photo math. I said it this morning, I'll say it again. If I was speaking tonight, I'd say it tonight, I'll say it tomorrow. I really believe that every photographer should have in his or her head, locked in, all the whole stop increments of ISO, so 100, 200, 400, 800, and so on. Aperture, 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, and so on. Shutter speed, 30, 60, 125, 250, 500,000, so on. And then if you're using flash, flash power. Fortunately, that's relatively easy if you work backwards in fractions. Full power, half, quarter, 8, 16, 32, so on and so forth. Because what I've done here is I made a 2-stop change in my shutter speed. And I think it's important to know, hey, if you go from 1/30th of a second to 125th, you sucked out 2 stops of ambient light with your shutter. So take the time to memorize those whole stops of those 4 camera setting and flash settings. Because this is the gateway to crafting dramatic light. So here's my simple 4-step workflow, all right? And if you're taking photos of the screen, wait until I get all 4 of them on, and then you won't have to figure out why you have 5 pictures that all say almost the same thing. And I'm going to take you through a quick shoot as well. So I'm going to explain the 4 steps, and then I'll show you how I implemented the 4 steps, okay? I often begin with my camera set to aperture priority mode, AV mode. And quite simply, I use the lowest ISO I can get away with. I choose an aperture that's going to give me the type of depth of field that I'm looking for. So in my world, I'm looking for shallow depth of field, so I shoot at 2.8 or 4, whatever's the widest aperture on my lens. If I want a moderate amount of depth of field, I'll shoot at 8 or 11. And if I want as much as I can grab, I'll shoot at 22. You could take away all the other f-stops on my lenses, and I would be okay. 3 f-stops, I'd be okay. All right? I'll just finesse it with shutter speed. But I really take it that simply. All right? Yeah?
You set your camera to whole stop increments on that stop?
I don't. I still have the 3rd stop increments in there. But coming up, 400 years ago as I did, having half stops was a huge thing. We didn't have partial stops of shutter speed. We did have half stops of aperture. But in a digital world, we have 3rd stops for everything. So I shoot an aperture priority because it's a relatively quick way for me to grab an exposure reading. Now people say, well, what about spot and evaluate? You know what? I don't really care. What I do care about is you're consistent in your framing. I'm taking a pictorial approach. I'm building towards an image, and it's going to take several shots to get there. It might be 5 shots. It might be 100. All right? I'm not promising. I'm not going to give you a 100-step workflow. So I take a reference frame at the aperture that I want, and I look at the shutter speed. All right? And I'm going to use my shutter to adjust the ambient. If it's a cloudy day and I need to make it look like it's sunny indoors, how do we do that? Use a really long shutter speed. Just grab that light. I guarantee it'll make it look like the sun is coming through the windows. You're not going to see direct shafts of light, but you'll see things blown out in the windows as if it was sunny outside. Now, living in Paso Robles, a little town halfway between LA and San Francisco near the coast, except for a couple months in the wintertime when it's raining, we pretty much have a sun-drenched environment. So in my part of the world, more often than not, I'm actually sucking ambient light out rather than adding it back. But my friends in the UK, they tell me exactly the opposite. They say, Syl, we need, if anything, to add light back to it. Okay, the opposite principle works as well. If you want the ambient light to be brighter, then use a longer shutter speed. Okay? There's one seat over here. If you don't have a seat in the back, welcome. All right, my third step, I finally turn on my flash. So again, I want to emphasize, I really focus on dialing in my ambient exposure first. Now, one thing, I'm going to step back. I guess I can do that with this button. Oops, nope, too many. There we go. So pop quiz, if I'm in aperture priority mode, what camera setting do I use to change my ambient exposure? What's it called? Anyone? Exposure. You guys should all sit next to this guy when it comes time to take the final exam. He's got all the right answers. Exposure compensation. Exposure compensation, when you're in aperture priority mode, changes the shutter speed beyond what was calculated by the camera by the amount you specify. So if I want to stay in aperture priority mode and I need less ambient, I'll dial in minus exposure compensation. How many of you shoot Nikon? Okay. If I say something that doesn't make sense to you, don't hesitate to call me out on it and we'll sort it out, because I know in the case of flash exposure compensation in Nikon, it works a little bit differently than Canon. I might not know the answer, but I got Joe McNally on speed dial, so we can get the answer. Okay, so if I'm in aperture priority, I'm going to use exposure compensation to adjust the shutter speed, fine-tune the ambient. What do I use if I'm in manual mode on my camera? Shutter speed, right. It's a trick question. You are the exposure compensator in manual mode. There's no way other than just to go dial the shutter speed where you want it. So people often get confused. What happened to exposure compensation when I switch into manual? Okay. So step number 3, jumping back and moving forward. Take a test shot with my flash on. Now, back in the days when I shot studio strobes exclusively, and a small flash was a quantum turbo, okay? Those were all manual only. And you know what? They were all off camera. This whole on-camera, off-camera phenomenon is a digital world phenomenon, okay? Try to put your pro photo head in your hot shoe. It doesn't carry very well, all right? So we implicitly, learning in the era that I did, always did off-camera flash, and it was always in manual mode. Now we have the option, do we put the speed light in the hot shoe, out of the hot shoe? Do we adjust the power on the speed light manually in manual speed light mode? Or do we have the camera adjust that power automatically in ETTL or ITTL? All right? So my general rule of thumb for those who have not heard it is I'm shooting in ETTL and Nikonians. Every time I say ETTL, just think ITTL, okay? And you have exactly the same concept. I shoot ETTL under a few situations. One, I'm in a dynamic environment where the subject of flash distance changes consistently. I'm shooting an event, and I have one of my sons holding a pole with a Elastilite Easy Box on the end of it and a wireless speed light in there, and sometimes that softbox is 2 feet from the person I'm photographing, and sometimes it's 6 feet. That's an ETTL situation because the subject of flash distance is dynamic, it's changing, okay? But what about that same event where they say, okay, now you've got to come up and gland hand some famous person VIP shots, and I've got to cram through a whole bunch of shots. Camera position doesn't change, VIP doesn't change, it's just the people coming in and out that change. In that situation, subject to flash distance does not change at all. It's not dynamic, it's static. So in that situation, I would shoot manual mode on my speed lights because I want the same amount of light coming out of those speed lights every time. Okay? So step number 3, I might be in manual or I might be in ETTL on my speed lights. If I'm shooting large lights, by definition, I'm shooting manual. So I take a test shot. When I'm shooting manual mode, I don't whip out a flash meter anymore, even though I often have it in my bag and say, oh yeah, ISO 100 f/5.8, you know. I don't do that. I just take a shot at 1/8 power. That's halfway down the power scale on my speed lights. And I go from there. In 3 test shots, I can determine, so what, voila, don't you know, number 4 is to adjust the flash power to my vision. So here's the things to think about. Steps 1 and 3, I'm just taking an image without really caring about what the settings are specifically. Do I care if it's shutter speed of 125 or 250? Only if my sync speed is less than 250. But no, not really. I care about my aperture because that controls depth of field. I don't really care about what my flash power is in step number 3. I just want a starting point to make some decisions. Do I need more or less? All right, so morning group, you already know the answer to this, but again, you can't tell my kids, any of you. You'll probably meet all of them in photos today. But I tell everyone except my kids, you don't know that you've gone far enough until you've gone too far. You don't know that you've gone far enough until you've gone too far. And what I mean by that is when I'm making an exposure move or I'm making a flash power move, I'll often make it in 2 or 3 stops rather than 1 stop. Hardly ever do I make a 1/3 stop move. Those are the little bumps between the whole fractions. All right? I make 1/3 stop move. That's like the last thing. That's like salting the soup. We're so close we could live without that adjustment, but just because we want to have like one more little iota of control. So let me show you how I impose this. Here's my friend Tom. Paso Robles, in addition to being a wine town, is also horse country. It's a very rural part of California. And Tom is focused on preserving the wagon wheel kind of lifestyle. So he's got this great tack room. The photograph on the left is the photograph that my camera wanted to make. Where do you know how to look in that photograph on the left? Are you supposed to look at the tack, or are you supposed to look at Tom? Okay? This is the difference in my mind between documentary photography and pictorial photography. I've put Tom in his environment. You get clues that he's a horsey person. He's got the cowboy hat and there's all that horse-looking stuff. If you've ever seen a Budweiser ad during the Super Bowl, you know, you've probably seen the Budweiser Clydesdales. So, and the other thing I did, what did I do with lighting here? On the photograph on the right, did I light the whole set or did I just light Tom? Yeah. All right, so let's go through how I got from where the camera wanted to make the photograph to where Syl finally stopped. So this is my camera set to aperture priority. Just as I said, it's a reference shot. We're deep into this ginormous barn that the light that's coming in is basically coming through an open doorway that's about 10 feet behind me, a little bit off to the side. Okay? I don't think there's ever been direct sunlight into this part of his barn, but I don't want you to know that, because again, I'm creating a pictorial representation of who Tom is as a horse person. So I look at that shot and I say, man, there is so much light. The camera's meter, its job is to make a decent exposure. Not the right exposure, because it's not programmed to know what's in your head. The right exposure is the one that creates the image that you as the photographer are after. All right? So I dialed in -1 stop of exposure compensation. So I'm shooting aperture priority. Whatever the camera came up with is the shutter speed. It used 1 shutter speed faster, 1 whole stop of shutter speed. So if the camera calculated a 30th of a second, it shot at a 60th of a second. All right? No flash. This is available light only. I have nothing against using available light, but oftentimes I find that it's not enough. So boom, I turn my flash on. Okay? Now in this instance, I was shooting in ETTL. And the camera metered this thing, and ETTL is kind of a mind twister anyway, and I don't freak out when I'm in ETTL mode and the flash is too bright or too dark. I just hit that little flash exposure compensation button that's conveniently from the right side on my camera, and then I dial the wheel on the back and I make a move. So I could see from the back of my camera, it's like I had totally blown out Tom's face. So I dialed down flash exposure compensation to a manageable level. There is no direct relationship, by the way, between exposure compensation and flash exposure compensation. I used to, before I actually put this stuff under the microscope to try to sort it out, I used to think, oh, definitely they're reciprocal. If you dial one down, you've got to dial the other up. Oh no, they're linked. If you dial one down, you have to dial the other down. There's no direct connection. Because the amount of flash that's flying out is a function of what the camera sees in front of it. And every generation of camera gets smarter and smarter in terms of its metering pattern. I'm totally thrilled about Canon's new 1DX. And I'm going to like auction off both kidneys on eBay next spring to get one. Okay.
Is there a CTO on it?
Great question. So the gentleman up here in the front asked, is there a color temperature orange gel on that speed light? And the answer is yes. We're going to talk about coloring flash later, but one of the secrets to making believable sunlight is to realize that the color of sunlight changes throughout the day. Now here we are in Manhattan, okay? I know the sun shines here in Manhattan on the street because one of the amazing things about Manhattan is midday the sun comes crashing down and starts bouncing around and people have 6 shadows because there's glass on all the high rises. It's amazing light here in these intersections for about 20 minutes every day, all right? In my part of the world, a setting sun, golden colored and has long raking shadows. So if you're trying to fake people out cinematically, you have to make sure that you have long raking shadows in the background of your image. If you color your flash and put it really high, nobody's going to believe that because we know sun warms up as it gets close to the horizon. When it gets close to the horizon, those shadows get really long. So that's where I started again, and that's where I ended in terms of 4 stops. So my pictorial approach is not one based upon light meters and formulas. Okay? It's based upon doing something and responding to what I just did. And oftentimes in 4 shots, I'm done. Question?
When you initially meter, do you use evaluative metering?
I don't really care, to be honest. I don't care. I could do it blind with, in my view, my pictorial view, I just want to get close. I want to get close and I'll make a move. So in this case, yeah, the short answer is yeah, I keep it in evaluative so that I look at as much of the world as I can. But truth be told, as long as you framed this thing, this shot consistently, and one thing to notice, do you see the composition changing much? Okay, that's a really important part of this workflow that I guess I need to come clean with and append in here. In order for this to work, you've got to be pretty consistent with your composition. Because I'm shooting in aperture priority, if I all of a sudden went vertical and zoomed in tight on Tom and didn't show the camera all of that dark tack in the background, then it's going to use a different shutter speed, right? So I often switch from aperture priority over to manual mode on my camera. All right? So how do I do that and when do I do that? I do it when I like get that thought in my head, all right? Because I'm not a checklist kind of guy. So I seldom start in aperture or in manual mode. Typically my camera's in aperture priority. And I can use exposure compensation. And then I'll look at the metadata and I'll go, okay, no worries. 1/25th at f8. And I'll just dial that in. I'll switch the camera over to manual mode. Because once I've got that set in for the ambient light, as long as the sun doesn't change its position to Tom significantly, which is not going to happen unless it just continues. I'm talking about over the course of a handful of seconds. If I shoot wide and close or far away and tight, it doesn't matter. That ambient exposure stays the same. So manual mode on your camera has the same consistency that manual mode on your speedlight has in terms of being the same from frame to frame to frame. Where people get all twisted up, both with camera exposure and flash exposure, flash power, in these automatic modes, is they don't think about the fact that if you have a wide shot that's got a light colored background and your subject right here who's wearing a tuxedo, the camera's going to meter completely differently for that wide shot than when you come in tight for the headshot. Now all of a sudden, instead of showing the camera 98% white, you're showing the camera 70% black. Well, of course, the camera's job is to convert this all to 18% gray, to medium shade of gray. And people get all twisted up because they think, oh my God, it changed. It changed because you showed the meter something completely different. Like I say, every generation of camera gets smarter than the one before it. Okay. Shadowing with off-camera flash. Lighting's important. Shadowing is more important. So for those of you who are starting your journey as speedlighters or strobists, flash photographers, I'm going to go through some fundamentals. When we have a speedlight in the hot shoe of our camera, that's called on-camera flash. And then when we move that speedlight off camera, conveniently, it's called off camera. But the significant difference is in the shadows. It's not the amount of light that's hitting Mallory's face that's changed. It's the position of the light, and that position causes shadows to be created. So when I have the speedlight bolted into the hot shoe on the left-hand side, you can see no texture in her blouse. In many ways, that shirt looks like a cardboard cutout. All right? And then you can see shape and form and texture on the right-hand side, and that's because you can see the shadow. Same thing with my friend Jamie. Lots of pretty girls and lots of cowboys around Paso Robles. So on-camera flash, this happened to be with a 7D and a 430EX speedlight in the hot shoe. Okay? So in this case, how many times have we made that photograph? And it's an okay snapshot. I don't want to take away and say that there's never a reason to have a speedlight in the hot shoe. There are lots of reasons. Snapshots being foremost among them. But understand that the physics of putting that light source right above the lens means that you're lighting both sides of your subject equally. You're lighting both sides of your subject equally, so there's no interesting shadows. And it's the shadows, again, that give you the ability to see the form and the shape and the depth in the photograph. Fundamental concepts, I agree. If you've been on your journey as a speedlighter a long time, don't take this for granted. Hard light is created because the light that hits the subject comes from a very narrow set of angles. Put another way, hard light is created when the light source is small relative to the size of what it's lighting. Okay? So a speed light inherently is small relative to most things that we pointed at. I could probably point a speed light at Barbie's head with no modifier and create soft light on Barbie because her head is smaller than the speed light, and the speed light would send light at multiple angles. Like that. But in the real world, when we're not photographing Barbie headshots, we can create soft light by intercepting the rays coming out of a speed light or a monolight, a studio pack, with some sort of diffuser, whether it's just a diffuser panel or something like the softbox over in the corner, okay, or an umbrella. All of those items work to making the size of the light source appear larger relative to the size of what's being photographed. And the reason that big thing works, it creates soft light, is because light coming at me from the right side is throwing shadows over here, but don't you know that the light coming from that side is filling these shadows while at the same time it's trying to throw shadows over this way. Okay? So the larger the light source, the more angles that the light comes at the subject from, the softer the light. So here's an example, hard and soft light, and I'll go ahead, oops. Gosh, that slide didn't work. I apologize for that. Hard and soft light on the shoes. And what I wanted you to see, but apparently the PowerPoint wizards are not working this afternoon. Must be on coffee break. The flyout behind those two images is basically a set shot. And what you see is a model standing there in those exact same shoes, very conveniently, with the diffusion panel behind her. And that's how the image on the right was created. Image on the left was created because she's lit with direct sun. Hard edge to those shadows, hard light. We drop in a 6 foot by 6 foot Laster Light skylight with a diffusion panel. It's just a big translucent panel. You could use a bed sheet, all right? You could use a bed sheet to do the same thing. It intercepts the sun, sends that light from multiple angles and softens those shadows. So the larger the light source, the softer the shadows are going to be. So a lot of people who are starting their journey as a speedlighter say, well, I want to create that soft beauty light. Well, then you need to think about modifiers like that Westcott Apollo orb over there, or a shoot-through umbrella, or a diffusion disc, anything that you can use to increase the apparent size of that speed light. Here's another thing that you have in your lighting and shadowing toolbox. The closer the light source is to the subject, the greater the fall off is going to be. It's like, okay, what the heck does that mean, Syl? Well, what this really means is, for more dramatic shadows, you want to push your softbox or your umbrella in as close to your subject as you can. And I'll suggest to most of you that it's the opposite of what you think you would do. I know when I was starting out with all of these mods, I intuitively thought, oh yeah, if I want harder shadows, I'm going to pull that light farther away. And I'll show you an example of that. So here's an umbrella. And interestingly, a photographer's umbrella is shaped just like the umbrellas you buy for $5 out on the sidewalk when it starts to rain. Made of translucent or reflective fabric. So a reflective fabric, we push the light into it, it bounces back, it becomes bigger and softer. Translucent, we push the light through it, and instead of the speed of the speed light being this big, now we have this white glowing orb that's this big. Okay? So when I push that umbrella in 4 feet from the model, you can see that I get some nice shadowing. Particularly look around the nose, the bridge of her nose and the chin. And when I take that umbrella and I pull it 16 feet away, all right, when I pull it 16 feet away, the shadows change because they become more even across the subject. If you've heard of the inverse square law and it scares you, you're a sane person. Anybody who spends a lot of time understanding the inverse square law shouldn't be doing that, really. Here's what the inverse square law says. As light gets farther away from the light source, it spreads out farther. Period. We're done. Okay? As light source gets farther away from the source, it spreads out. It gets dimmer. So here are the 3 Arena lads. Tom on the left, Vin in the middle, and Tony on the right. Tom just turned 18, Vin just turned 17. Tony, 2 days ago, turned 14. 14 going on 40, it seems like some days. So I've got my flash 4 feet away from the Arena brothers. And you can see on the left-hand side that Tom's face is relatively well lit, but Tony's face is really in the shade. And then in the right-hand image, I pulled the speed light back on the stand. We literally got out the tape measure. So it was 16 feet away. And voila, Tom's face is well lit, Vin's face is well lit, and Tony's face is well lit. So I talk about shadowing. If you're lighting groups and you don't have multiple light sources to come at that group from, then the thing you need to do is to pull your light away from that group. Now, knowing what we know about the inverse square law, the farther away we get, what happens? The more it spreads out, the dimmer it gets. So how many stops of light do you think there are between 4 feet and 16 feet? 4. And you want to know the weird thing about this? All right? You can use distances the same way that you have your f-stops memorized. 1 f-stop away, no, it's not double, it's 1.4. So you can go 4, 5.6 feet, 8, 11, 16 feet, 4 stops. If you're shooting your speed light in manual mode, you've got to go up in power 4 stops. I didn't move that light 4 stops away from Tom and have his face magically have the same amount of light on it. The footnote on here should say, hey, dummy, Syl remembered finally to turn up the flash power by 4 stops. Okay, so making the flash bigger. Diffusion panels on the left. If you're just beginning, go buy a 5-in-1 diffusion reflector disc set. Cost you about 25 bucks. And what you'll get is a 43-inch reflector disc with a zippered cover. One side will be solid black, another side will be solid white, and then on the inside you'll probably have silver, and then you'll have silver and gold or just gold. So you can use that disc to shoot the speedlight through the diffuser disc with the cover removed, or you can use it with the cover on, either the silver, the black, or the gold, to bounce your speedlight into, or to bounce available light, sunlight in to fill the shadows. Okay, so that's where I would begin, a 5-in-1 reflector disc. And then I would work my way through umbrellas for a little bit. Now, I'm not a huge fan of umbrellas because they're really not precise. They're kind of like the hand grenade of light modifiers. Literally, an umbrella will throw light in a really, really wide arc. And in the kind of pictorial lighting that I do, I often, almost always, want to light my subject differently than the background that the subject is standing in front of. All right? If you try to light your subject and your background simultaneously with the same light source, more often than not, you'll be dissatisfied with the quality of the light. So what I'm able to do then with the softbox, and the one you can barely see on the left-hand side, is a big brother of this that's square. And a nice thing about the Apollo softboxes is that they have a very defined edge to them. So I can light, I can feather, I can turn that softbox and light my subject, but put that edge of the light flying out of the softbox such that it hits his shoulder, but not the background behind him. Okay? Now, if making the flash seem bigger makes it softer, trick question here, what do you think making the flash appear smaller does? Doesn't necessarily make it harder, because boy, that light flying straight out of your speedlight is hard enough. It's going to create really distinct shadows. So what I really mean by this is controlling where the flash goes and doesn't go with some precision. So you have a built-in modifier to your speedlight that oftentimes is overlooked. You can use the manual zoom setting on your speedlight for a wide range of theatrical effects. So on the left-hand side, you see my son Tony, Sherpa number 3, with the little plastic garage door pulled out, and that thing throws light everywhere. I very, very seldom use it. And then on the right side, what you see is the flash zoomed all the way to the other end, 105 millimeters. Okay? So when I say I choose to be a photographer and not a retoucher, I am fully aware that you could go into Photoshop and create a layer mask and put this vignette in here in post. I'd much rather take 3 seconds and do it in real time and be done with it. Okay? And there's a whole range. If you want to do something a bit boring but really instructive, get your speedlight on a stand, point it straight at a white wall, put your camera on a tripod 6 or 8 feet behind that speedlight, and basically position the camera so that at the speedlight's widest zoom setting, you can get all of the illumination pattern on that wall. And then without changing the position of the speedlight or the position of the camera, make photographs of each of those zoom settings. Go in through manually and dial them. And then if you want to get like the bonus points, you turn your speedlight sideways and you put it right up against the wall so that not only can you see the circle this way, but you can also, from the sideways shots, you can see that you got to have a pretty big wall to make this work. But you can see the angle of throw. And I know from my own experience at 105 that it's no longer a circle of light. It's this kind of rectangle that kind of, as you can see, has a little slant to it here. But you want to create some dramatic light. Just zoom it, speedlight tight, and pop it at your subject's nose. Okay? And you'll get this really interesting fall off. So these guys, Rogue Flash Benders. And those who know me know that I have really strong opinions about lots and lots of gear, and I'm not shy about sharing them. So things I like, I really, really like, and things that I don't talk about perhaps means I don't like them, or that I've forgotten. But I love this Rogue Flash Bender. And the reason that I love this thing is it's a multi-purpose gadget. So it was designed with 3 aluminum stays in the back, and one of the things you can do if you're out in a big space and you've got nothing to bounce off of, but you want to make your speedlight, you're at a park, let's say, you're at a birthday party at a park. strap this onto your speed light pointed straight up, and it makes the light a little bit softer. It's not going to look like a softbox, mind you, okay? But it definitely helps. Another reason that I love this thing is that I can strap it onto the side of a speed light and use it as a flag, meaning that I'm going to send the light right to this gentleman, and it's going to light, I can light his shoulder, but everything behind him is not going to have any light on it because this is so big. And white to the inside, what happens is that light's bouncing off the side of this, and when it hits the end, it flares out like a small funnel. But black, because black is not reflecting any of the light, it basically lets the light come out just as a tight tube, okay? I really like, as I said, the large Rogue flash bender. I'm not as much a fan of the medium one. The medium one is half as long, and I don't get as much bounce, I don't get as much flag, and I don't get as much snoot control. What you get is like a $15 savings, okay? A bargain at the time, but over the life, many, many, many years that you would use it, I think you'd find this size would be much, much more conducive to making great images. So grids. Grids are a really simple and dramatic way to control where light flies, all right? So the shot on the left is a studio shot that I did, and that's basically bare flash flying straight at the model, okay? Zoomed, head was zoomed to 105. It's lighting her head, her face, and then it falls off, and I'm using the ambient light, and I'll show you a set shot in a minute so you can see where that ambient light's coming from. But then I said to her, look, I want you to think about being in a dark alley, and you've taken a wrong turn, and now all of a sudden, things have gone awry. Just give me all of those expressions. And this young lady, she was 15 at the time. Man, she was amazing. 40 shots, 40 different looks, okay? So the difference between these two images, in addition to her gesture, is the fact that then I gridded the speed light, and it just created that small pool of light on her face, and everything else fell away to darkness, all right? There's another shot. We just played, she gave me looks, and we moved the light here and there. Okay, so this is the set that we worked on. It was inside a large warehouse. The ambient light source were these gross overhead fluorescent fixtures. And that's the lighting rig, okay? Made by Impact. It's a little miniature beauty dish. Boy, there's an oxymoron if I've ever heard of one, okay? A beauty dish works by making the light source bigger. Again, if I photograph Barbie, then this beauty dish, which is 6 inches in diameter. If you want to see it, I have a well-traveled version in my bag down here. I can pull it out. And basically, the beauty dish comes with these little removable reflector discs on the inside. Unscrew those, toss them away. Now what you have is a nice strap-on grid holder for your speed light. And these use 5.5-inch grid sets. And the reason that I like this, if any of you are familiar with Honel Photo, Dave Honel makes plastic framed grids that's basically attached right to the front of the speed light. I used those for years and years until I came upon this system, which a little bit more expensive, a little bit more cumbersome. I think the quality of the light is more distinctive. How do I know that? Same thing. Set up the light stand, fired it into the wall, and took a look at the shot. So any modifiers that you want to work with on a regular basis, do all of those test shots so you come to understand not only what the shape of the light is, but how it transitions off to shadow. And as importantly, are there any cool looks right on that penumbra, that edge between light and shadow, where that transition is happening? Some modifiers have these incredible bands, almost like the rings of Saturn, that you can just, if you can lay them right across your subject's face, can be very, very dramatic. Okay. Lighting compass. I was a Boy Scout. I'm now an assistant scoutmaster, so I think very well in terms of the compass, north, south, east, west. If you're not as familiar with north, south, east, west, then think about a clock. 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock works equally well. But where you position your speed light is the real point of the lighting compass. Understanding the types of shadows that you can get as your light source circles around behind your subject. Okay? So at the bottom, we basically have at 0 degrees or at 6 o'clock, we basically have on-camera flash. Then we can continue to move, and this works, believe me, the shadows work equally well whether you go to the right or to the left. So one thing I encourage all of my lighting students to do is to get a friend parked on a stool, a very patient friend, and you basically work your light stand 360 degrees, and it helps for consistency if you put your camera on a tripod. When I'm shooting for blogs, books, workshop, demonstrations, I use a tripod. I want that consistency frame to frame to frame. When I'm really shooting, very seldom do I have my tripod around unless I know that I'm going to be photographing after dark. So I encourage you, when you do these kind of shots, do it on the tripod so that the only thing changing from frame to frame is the position of that one light. Okay? So you can also think about it, not only the circle around your subject horizontally, but an arc over the top of your subject as well. Just like the sun flies through our sky. Okay, so you can experiment with that. If this was an all-day workshop or a week-long workshop, we would spend more and more time running through these concepts and exploring and setting them up. But where your light is in a circle around your subject and in an arc over and even below, but be careful when you put your light below your subject. Okay, fill light below, fine. Key light, the main light below your subject, a bit problematic, because biologically we know that light in our world comes from above and that shadows fall. When shadows rise, we have something gone wrong in our world. So horror lighting, scary movie lighting, is created by putting lots of light down low so the shadows go up. We all, at one time or another at a slumber party, probably put the flashlight to our chin to try to tell a ghost story. Same kind of thing. So generally, we'll work our lights in a circle around our subject and in an arc over our subject. Question?
When you have light bouncing from the floor,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the floor is white, so then you feel flat. How do you know like?
Okay. So if I understand your question, and don't hesitate to correct me.
Yeah.
If I understand your
So
question
you
correctly.
say the light bouncing from
Okay.
the floor.
Okay. So the thing with putting light down low and bouncing it off the floor, if it's a light-colored floor, or you can take a silver or white reflector, anything that's available to you, the bridegroom, get them to lie on the floor. If you need a little bit of light coming back up, that's the key, a little bit of light. You'll know when it becomes overpowering because you'll see shadows on the top side of the nose and top side of the
Maybe
cheekbones.
it's just a white sidewalk or something like you cannot
Sure.
control. It's in the ambient, not that I'm
Right.
causing it. It's just bouncing.
Right? So oftentimes if it's bouncing down below, it's coming from a source above. So it's not like you're actually lighting from below, you're just getting fill light from below. And the whole key to it ultimately is what those shadows look like. And as long as the shadows have a natural disposition that they're below the object that's creating the shadows, then the world is fine. My chin shadow is down here rather than hitting my nose, all is fine. Okay? That's one of the things I love about Manhattan. Again, on a sunny day you walk around and the way the light just flies off the buildings and the sidewalks, it's really beautiful. Beautiful. So one of the things that I'm very fond of with speed lights, and I think this is an advantage speed lights have over studio strobes, it's easier to gel a speed light because it's small. And I cut my own gels these days. I buy a 20 by 24 inch sheet of Roscoe gel, costs you $6 here in the store, and you can get 24 gels out of that one sheet. Now you can use gaffer's tape or you can get Velcro strips if you want to be fancy, but I want to take you through some ideas in how to use gels. And there's two broad categories of things you can do with gels. You can color correct or you can create dramatic color. And I'll give you examples of both. So color correction, we're going to look at a sunset shot that I did. So on the left is my friend Mallory, and we've got the setting sun, and literally I've got 3 minutes of sunlight left. It's sitting right on the horizon. You can tell from the shadow of her collarbone. Point the camera at her. It's not a bad photograph on the left. That's available light only. But I'd like a little bit of fill flash, okay? So that's where I want to end up. But that's not where I start, unless you've been to my seminar. What most people would do is go off camera with their fill flash, great. But they'd forget that the color of light coming from our speed lights is the color of sunlight at noon. It's not the color of sunlight coming through a thicker layer of atmosphere just before sunset. So what you have on the left, and I see this all the time in ads and photo magazines from photographers who should know better and art directors who should know better. You don't use bare flash for fill work at sunset, at least, and get it past me. All right? So one of the gels that's a staple in my arsenal is called a CTO, color temperature orange. It's basically an amber gel. Gels were invented in Hollywood 100 years ago. Literally, back in the days, you know those big searchlights that they would use, like in World War II, they were for real purposes, and now we just pull them out on the arc lights. We pull them out for the Academy Awards and things like that. That was a main source of lighting in Hollywood. And they had to take those arc lights, two tips of carbon with electricity being crammed through them, and that brilliant white light, and make that look like different colors of light. So color temperature orange is a staple. It has a cousin, CTS, color temperature straw. Did somebody say CTB? Okay. So CTO or CTS, color temperature orange, color temperature straw, are great for sunsets. CTB is for taking a tungsten light source and making it look like noonday sun. Why it's ever put in a speed light kit is a mystery to me. Because our speed lights are already in noonday sun. So putting a blue in for color correction, yeah.
You could put a half cut maybe to match the deep shade.
Okay, there's a fair example. So the gentleman's suggestion, I think rightly so, maybe put a half CTB on your flash, or if you're shooting in open shade or deep shade, then you've got that color balance there.
Because moonlight is lunar white, which is a blue white.
Okay, so maybe, I love this. I learned, so moonlight is really recycled sunlight though, right?
It is, but it's blue.
Okay.
It's a shift over.
Okay.
In fact, we have signals in the subway that are lunar white, and that's why
Okay.
they're bluish.
We don't have a subway in Paso Robles yet.
I know.
Yeah, but it's a nice town anyway. All right, so there's the difference. Again, gelling, blending that fill flash in is really, really important, okay? It's not a perfect match, but if I didn't point my finger at it and say it's not a perfect match, and if you just showed this to your friends or to a magazine person, they'll go, nice job. They're not even going to think about it. However, I can point fingers at many people in the photo world who've published images in magazine where they did fill flash and they didn't gel it, and it just screams out and says, fundamental mistake. So that's the gel that I used to create this. My favorite gels were developed by David Honnell, a globetrotting photojournalist, who came up with this ingenious little thing called a speed strap. And this is my gel kit. It doesn't weigh but a couple of ounces. And it's an accordion fold coupon recipe card thingamabobber. So I have these Velcro speed straps in the back, and then I have an assortment of color correction and also theatrical effect, dramatic effect gels in there. And on a good day, this kit is completely organized twice a year. And the rest of the time I'm hunting and pecking, but I generally have 4 of the various shades of CTO. So I go from quarter to half to full to double CTO, depending upon what I want to do. And the reason that I like this approach over all the other types of gels is that in 2 seconds I can change a gel. So the speed light gets a speed strap, conveniently named. And so there's a quarter CTO and a half CTO. And I'll start with a quarter CTO, and it's on, okay? And the thing I like about the Honnell size gels is they're bigger than the flash head. So I don't have to worry about aligning this thing. And believe me, when I have 2 minutes to figure out which is the right gel to put on and then work with my subject to get expressions and get enough shots, okay, the last thing I want to do is take 3 minutes to make sure this is aligned properly. And then I go, okay, that's not it, that's too light. Okay, and I'm back in business. How long did that take? Now, granted, if there's a breeze, that's going to blow away, which is why I try to have 4 in my kit. Okay.
It's available here in B&H?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. So Honel, this is from Honel Photo, and they sell them as sets. So there's a color correction set that has half CTO, full CTO.
It's called Honel Gel Kit?
HONL, and then color correction gel. You know what? I think Dave uses the word filters. So if you just go to the counter and ask them Honel Photo gels or filter kit, they'll get you squared away. Okay, and you need the speed strap as well. So indispensable. Now, once you get into it, and you realize, this costs you like $3 or $4 each, and you can buy a sheet that's 20 by 24 inches for $6. Cut your own, put your own Velcro strips on there. Well, one sheet, $6 sheet, will give you 24 of these, which is probably a lifetime supply for most of us. So you might not need that much, so but you've got to buy several different colors. So get together with a friend, split the sheet, go in 4 ways, cut them up. Okay, if you do photo meetups, it's a great idea. You can save tons and tons of money cutting your own gels. Okay. All right, so moving on. Creating dramatic light. There are literally no rules. There are no rules. So for those of you who were with me this morning, we looked at a couple of the shots from this set, but you didn't see, or the shoot, you didn't see a set shot. This is my friend Mark Kranek, who runs Jersey Style Photography, which is a great blog to read. Okay, and Mark is a big fan of cinema noir. Now, traditionally, cinema noir is always done in black and white. There's the detective, cigarettes with no filters on them, a gun, usually smoking, a dame, some dead guy with chalk marks around him. The type of movie I'm talking about. So, I live in a world of color, and I am adamant that I have no interest in black and white photography. So I'm trying to do homage to a black and white film genre in color. This is our set in Asbury Park. Anybody been to Asbury Park? As a Bruce Springsteen guy, is like, oh yeah, I'll go to Asbury Park, that'll be cool. Well, how boring is Asbury Park, Like everything's, not everything, but a lot of it's not like it used to be. And we found these empty storefronts, and the shadow that you see from that speed light on the stand is being created by a sodium vapor light. The sun has gone down about 30 minutes prior to when we started shooting. Okay? So our ambient light source is pretty consistent from that sodium vapor light. All right? So this is basically the shot when I just was setting up, and I said, hey Mark, get out that cigarette, here we go. And then using a faster shutter speed to dim the ambient, like kill it, suck it all out. Okay? How do you do an ambient test shot? So I'm shooting flash, and all of a sudden I say, I want to know what the camera's recording in my ambient light. What do? Shut your flash off, exactly. So halfway through your shoot, or whenever you think about it, flick the switch and shut your flashes off so you can say, okay, now I know what my ambient light's doing. I'll show you some more examples of that as we move on. So this is one of my favorite photographs of Mark. And the funny thing is, it's like he's hotboxing these Lucky Strikes, okay, to get that long ash there. He's going through one like every 2 minutes. And this is a guy who works for Johnson & Johnson and doesn't smoke, except when he does this kind of stuff, okay? So I love this photograph. With 2 gelled speed lights, I was able to create this cool kind of colored light. That's as close to black and white cinema noir as I think I will ever get. None of this was done in post. This is the capture. Maybe a little bit of a saturation move on the slider, but I think that's perfectly fine. Pretty much I use Lightroom, and my view is anything I can get in that develop module for the most part on the simple stuff, not the localized corrections, all of that's like choosing film stock. One thing that people who've only shot digital don't realize is that back in the film days, photographers' choice of film went a long way towards affecting the look of the images that were created. If I was shooting catalog work and they wanted flat, neutral color, then I shot EPP Ektachrome. If you wanted really punchy, saturated, cool-looking color, then you shot Fuji Velvia. All right, when I was a young kid, I shot Kodachrome 25. Can you imagine ISO 25? I would love that on my camera. There are times where it's like, there is so much sun out there, please, let's dim it down just a little bit. Kodachrome 25 used to do that quite nicely. All right, so back on task. So when you're doing pictorial or cinematic kind of portraits, one of the things you need to do is to be open to screw-ups. So yours truly was firing away, and all of a sudden I realized, oh, I'm going faster than the flash on the right is recycling. And quite by accident, again, not paying attention because we're just having fun, I created this image of just the red light. And I actually love, it's one of the stronger images of the series. Okay? And then likewise, one time I was shooting Mark and I got ahead of the red light. It's like, well, that's pretty cool too. Okay? If you haven't figured out, these images over here are much truer to color than the big screen. It's a great projector. I'll take it home if they don't want it. But these screens have the better color. So be open to mistakes happening. It's not like I had this pre-visualized concept. I started with a concept. I did something, I responded to it. And that's basically do something, respond, do something, respond, do something, respond. I can't tell you the number of times where I've done like 100 shots in a shoot. And sometimes the hero shot is shot number 99. Yep. And sometimes the hero shot is shot number 30. But I kept pushing through that idea so far until you finally you realize, I just got to stop because I have no idea what I'm really after. If I could figure out, okay, did I get that hero shot at 30 and not do the other 70 shots? I'd love that. Now I live in a sun-drenched world, so I feel like I have to be an evangelist in many ways and sharing reasons to use flash outdoors under broad daylight. A lot of times people think, oh, I got to turn on my flash because it's dim. If anything, I'd say the opposite is true. All right? One of the things that we need to understand is that as good as our cameras are, they are not as sensitive as the human eye and brain are to seeing differences between bright brights and dark darks. That range between the bright brights and the dark darks is called dynamic range of an image. So what happens in a digital world is we're ideally going to create an exposure that preserves the most important bright areas of the image. Keep in mind, most important, bright areas. You may not care if the detail in the snow blows out and you can't see this flakes of snow. That may not be important to you. If you're a wedding photographer, though, blowing out the bride's dress so that grandma's lace that came over on the Mayflower can't be seen, that's a problem. That's an important highlight you need to protect. So depending upon the dynamic range of the image and the scene, the camera may or may not be able to record it. So I headed down to a local car dealer one day, high noon in Paso Robles, because I wanted to find a shiny object with a deep shadow underneath it. And if you look really closely, you can see yours truly with his camera and the tripod and the fender, trying to sneak in every one of my photographs. And this example on the left demonstrates the challenge the camera has in recording the shadow detail when I set the exposure to protect the important highlights, like in the reflectors on the headlamp. So what did I do to create the image on the right? I used flash. Broad daylight, but I used flash to fill the shadows. And there we go, another self-portrait of yours truly. So I've got the master speedlight on that little stand on the left, and it's communicating a set of instructions to the slave speedlight that I'm literally holding in my arm. Okay? A lot of people around the world know of me, but nobody really understands. I don't have an assistant, so it's like oftentimes, trying to get the shutter button and the slave in the right position. So basically, I threw light into the shadowy areas of the image because the camera didn't have the ability to record that detail on its own. I could clearly see the tread in the tire, and I could see the texture in the asphalt under the car. But the camera has no ability to record that bright range, that wide range of bright brights and dark darks. Okay? So in the context of creating cinematic light, I have learned so much from watching all those little things at the end of the DVD, like how they made it. At the Arena House, we always watch those little episodes, particularly to see if they show anything about how they lit a particular movie. So much to learn from that.
Do you use the dynamic range setting on the Mark II, like the little V?
Yeah, so do I use the dynamic range setting on the Mark II? No.
Does it do anything? Because
I haven't tested it. You know, they add features that are just kind of like, and I told several of you earlier, you know, to get one more thing in my head, I have to like have something else come crashing out. So I'm definitely in those regards an old dog in terms of learning these new tricks. Yeah.
It only affects JPEG also.
It doesn't affect the JPEG. That doesn't matter.
Only JPEG.
It only affects the JPEG?
So if it's
Okay.
if it's active delighting on Nikon,
Okay.
then basically it tries to underexpose the image a little bit and then brings it up.
Okay.
And see if it's a raw photo, you can just do that yourself. On
Right.
Lightroom.
So the gentleman said, at least in active delighting for Nikon, that it affects only the JPEG, that the light move can be made in camera raw. I don't disagree with that at all. So, all right, so fill flash with sunlight. One of my favorite lighting techniques is to take two light sources and point them right at each other, and then put my subject right in between. So oftentimes that light source, at least one of them, is the sun. And then I'll take my fill flash and I'll point it right at that person in line with the sun. Okay? Putting the sun behind the subject takes you, and many times, right to the edge of catastrophe, and I would suggest that's right where you want to be as a speedlighter, as a flash photographer. Right on the brink of total disaster because the sun is about to fly into the lens and melt all the optics and the circuitry in the camera. Just kidding about that part. But what you get is a beautiful backlight. What you get is beautiful rim light. I developed this awareness when I was shooting horticulture because leaves are translucent. Foliage looks best when sunlight is flying through it rather than flying onto it and bouncing back to the lens. So there's garden photography 101, backlight everything. Okay? So the challenge becomes with our dynamic range here. We've got the sun, the main light source on this set behind our subject. We have to come in with fill flash. Okay? So here, in this case, was a pre-visualized image that I was out to capture. This falconer with this young bird, the moment that the bird was landing on her glove. All right? But she is so cool and so confident at what she does that she has her presence coming straight down the throat of the lens. All right? It took more than a couple shots to get that, by the way. All right. One of the things that I do routinely is I change the weather with my shutter. Okay? Underexposing the ambient light, I touched on this earlier. Underexposing the ambient light is an important part of my repertoire. And then I come back with my flash and I add the light that my subject needs. Okay, so here's my son, Vin. We were doing the Smashing Pumpkins shoot that appeared on the cover of Speedlighter's Handbook. And I said, hey, just come over here, because he was happened to be wearing this hoodie from the Spy Museum in London. All right? Anybody been to the Spy Museum in London? Have this souvenir hoodie? It's very popular. But to me, it was iconic. Vin at 13 or 14 years of age at the time. And the whole, if you know Vin, deny everything, it fits. I love him dearly, and it fits. So on the left is the camera image. This is aperture priority, no flash. That's the image the camera's programmed to make. Clouds are blown out. And I'm not going to disagree in terms of dynamic range. I wasn't seeing a lot of detail in those clouds. We can add a ton of drama by underexposing the ambient light and then bringing the light back to the subject. Okay? Now this image here was not created, it's got beautiful soft light on Vin, but it wasn't created with softboxes. It was created with direct flash. We did the Smashing Pumpkins shoot as a test for what would happen if we used 12 speed lights all at the same time with radio popper ETTL triggers bolted onto them, all gear on loan from Canon and radio popper. And I was stunned about how soft and beautiful that light was. And so, again, the same thing. It's creating shadows on this side that are being filled by the lights over there, because he was basically wrapped around with lights. And I've taken a lot of guff from folks that say, well, you shoot with 12 speed lights. I only have one. It's like, well, yeah, but let's talk about your friends. You know, he has 2, he has 1, he has 2, and that guy has 6. So you really need to get to go know that guy, okay? And just have some meetups, either privately organized ones or formally organized ones. But get together and gang your lights up. You can do wonderful things with them. All right, so dimming the sun step by step. I know the sun is going to come back. Maybe not in Manhattan today, but soon. So here's Tony number 3, Sherpa number 3. Really happy today, as you can tell. It's like, are you kidding me, Dad? Another lighting demo for that book? I am so sick of this. So notice the consistency of his gaze. Notice the consistency of his positive attitude, frame to frame to frame. So this is the shot, full sun, f/22, as the camera would make it. It's a snapshot, basically. I was like, all right, I'm going to add one EV, one f-stop. EV is a term that Nikonians are familiar with. EV stands for exposure value. I jump back and forth, so we'll say today 1 stop of light. So the shutter speed was 1 stop wider or longer, overexposed. Now I'm going to go back, and I'm going to just take you through. We don't need to pause and look at every one, but these are whole stop increments. So again, this is the shot the camera wanted to make, the shot the camera's programmed to make. Look what happens to the sky, and look what happens to the details on the Arena mobile and Tony's shirt and his positive, engaging expression. Okay, 2 stops down. Sky's nice, inky black. All right. 3 stops down, it begins to look sort of like a moonlight. Okay. 4 stops down, boy, we're really starting to lose everything, okay, including Tony's positive attitude in these photographs, which in this case is a good thing if you actually had a chance to see that scowl. 5 stops down, all right. 6 stops down. Okay, and we lost the signal. It just became black. So the point being that in terms of the camera's ability to record brights and darks, between the bright sun of noon and pure black is 6 f-stops. So if you know that, you can go dial in any time of day under any kind of light you want. Let that light control the ambient portion of your frame, the part of the frame that you can't light, and then bring the light to your subject. Okay? I'm going to give you a crash course in high-speed sync. This is a really important speed light only. And I don't care what you spell speed light, L-I-G-H-T like Nikon or L-I-T-E like Canon. Okay? Nikonians, you'll recognize this as being auto FP sync. You cannot do high-speed sync with studio packs. People say, oh, I'll just do that with my Pro Photo Head. I'm sorry, you cannot fire Pro Photo Head at a 4,000th of a second. Okay? But with the speed light or a group of speed lights, we can. So very quickly, because I want to start answering some of your questions. In normal sync mode, the camera has to fire the speed light during the gap between the 2 curtains. Our shutters or mechanisms have 2 curtains, conveniently called first and second or front and rear curtain. And at slower shutter speeds, there's a point where the first curtain is completely clear of the sensor before the second curtain has begun to move. And at faster shutter speeds, the second curtain actually begins to move before the first curtain is completely clear of the sensor. That's really important because we have to shoot the flash at a point when the sensor is completely clear of both curtains. And that shutter speed, whatever it is on your camera, is the camera's sync speed. So for most of you, it's a 250th of a second. If you have a Canon 5D Mark II, it's a 200th of a second. All right? So again, putting pictures in, anybody know why these images are upside down? This guy was not upside down, although he certainly could have been. Image in our camera is actually upside down, just like the image in the back of our eyeball and our brain flips it. So the same thing, we have to fire the flash in that frame there, shown by the yellow band, at that point when the first curtain is completely open and the second curtain has yet to move. Because if we fire at any faster shutter speed, a portion of the sensor is going to be covered while the flash fires. So question, yeah?
Is that something to do like with that? I don't know if you can do it in visual assistance. Is that like dragging the shutter?
So dragging the shutter is the opposite. Dragging the shutter is using long shutter speeds to gather in ambient light in dim light situations.
So, and one more thing, so there's a difference between dragging the shutter and slow sync.
So dragging the shutter is, again, is using a slow shutter speed with flash so that the ambient on the background burns in. What we're talking about is using extremely fast shutter speeds, presumably to dim the ambient sunlight, and then to figure out a way to get flash to sync with them. So high-speed sync or auto FP sync works a little bit differently. The camera changes the way the speed light fires, and it turns it for a very brief period of time into a continuous light source. It does that by turning that flash on and off 30,000 times a second. Now that comes at an expense. It basically sucks out 2.5 stops of flash power. So your flash in high-speed sync appears much dimmer than in normal mode. All right? But the benefit is, just like we can use any shutter speed under sunlight because the sun is a continuous light source. So by turning the flash on and off so many times per second, we can use faster shutter speeds. So there we go. There's our skateboarder. And the flash fires when the first curtain is traveling. The flash is still firing when the first and the second curtain are traveling. And the flash continues to fire while the second curtain closes. Okay? So neutral density. Neutral density basically is like a pair of sunglasses for your lens. And if you're using studio strobes, you all familiar with the work of Joey L., young photographer here in New York? Did engaging things with pro photo gear and exotic places and very handsome people. So Joey was able to underexpose that ambient light in Africa by putting a neutral density filter on his camera. All right, great if your subject is not moving. You can focus, say just wait there. I'm going to put the sunglasses on, and then make the shot. And that was the way that Joey was able to underexpose the ambient light and make those engaging photographs. If you're trying to focus or follow action, it's really hard to do that through a neutral density filter. Okay? I have in my bag almost always a Vera ND. It's a variable density filter. And it goes from 2 stops to 8 stops. 8 stops you can't even see through. Okay? Landscape photographers love this filter because you can go to the beach or you can go to a mountain stream and take really long shutters and make all that water turn into these nice romantically flowing little streams. All right. So I want to take you through a handful of shoots for about 15 minutes, and then we'll stop and we'll jump on a bunch of questions, okay? So I mentioned, at least I hope I did, my friend Zach Arias, who's known belovedly as Mr. One Light, whose philosophy is buy a piece of gear, master that piece of gear until you move on to another one. So I'm going to light Zach Arias for my book. Do you think I'm going to use multiple flashes for Zach? Absolutely not. All right? So how did I light this image? One flash. One speed light to camera right. Okay, I'll show you what that image looks like. That's half of the story. Exactly. I flew most of the light past Zach's nose into a big gold reflector that was then pushing that light into the door behind him. Okay? Here's the shot on the right with speed light only. Okay? Notice the warmth of the reflector on Zach, the fill light, okay, the left side of the frame, how he's got that kind of spray-on tan, gently applied, of course, just to the right amount, that golden glow, all right? That's coming from the gold fabric on the reflector. So you don't need to have tons and tons of speed light. I'm really proud of this image. Zach's a great guy, and I love that image of him, even if I didn't make it.
On the left, you use
Oops.
silver reflector?
It's gold. It's gold. So again, if we can go, there we go. Let's get the fly out. So speed light is off to the side. Most of it is flying past Zach's nose, hitting the reflector. So the speed light's here. It's coming in front of Zach, and the reflector is steeply angled. It's literally right outside the camera frame, and its purpose is to throw that light onto the door in the back. You see how the bright side of Zach's jacket is against the dark side of the door, and the dark side of Zach's jacket is against the bright side of the door? It's split lighting, okay? It's one of the things that makes this image a happy accident, shall we say. All right.
I like how you do the.
Yeah.
Did you put a gel on the speed light?
Nope. Nope. It was straight flash, and then the warmth came off the gold cover of that reflector. All right. So, all right. So if you were in the class this morning, no fair shouting out the answers. Here's my Chicago Bob shoot. Okay, he's a living historian in the old town of Virginia City, Nevada. And Virginia Bob was a guy who was on the vigilante squad in Virginia City in the 1800s. And on any given day in Virginia City, Nevada, there are these folks walking around as docents, and they will tell you who they are, and they are all historical personas in the history of that town. So, what time of day was this photograph made? Anytime. Good man. What was the weather like outside? Anyone else? It was raining. Okay, could be anything. It was raining when this was made. All right. The key point here in terms of creating dramatic light, because that's what the ambient light looked like inside that room when I got done sucking the light out with my shutter. There's no ambient light to speak of in this photograph. How do I know that? I turn the flashes off. Okay, I start with my ambient. It's like, all right, I know if I go 4 stops down on my shutter speed from the ambient, I can suck out virtually every bit of ambient, or at least every important bit of ambient. So what I did is I ran the master speed light over to the window in the room on a cord that was communicating to the camera. There were 2 speed lights outside with CTO gels on them underneath Ziploc bags out in the rain. And the great thing about this system is once we had those lights outside set up, which happened before it started to pour, we didn't have to run outside to make changes on those slaves. I was able to do that via the built-in system that Canon has in their speed lights, all right? So I was able to dial the power up and down, and the reason that shot has that believable sunset quality of light is a combination, again, of the CTO gel and the steep angle. So those speed lights were just slightly above Bob's head as they were coming through that window. So from time to time, I shoot for a magazine called San Luis, out of the town San Luis Obispo, and it's basically all the creatives, the writers, the photographers, the illustrators, everybody just throws in their work for free. It's a public effort. And so they asked me to make a photograph of a pit bull. It's like, okay, why? And they said, well, we're doing an article on wineries that adopt dogs, and Cass Winery has a reputation of being a place that has adopted out a whole bunch of animals. And there's a pit bull there that's very sweet, and we want a photograph of her for the article. I said, well, I know Cass Winery because I had just shot this wedding there a few months before. It's one wedding. I looked like a total rock star, okay? Because I knew the folks at Cass. So there's the shot that ran in the magazine, okay? And again, the idea behind this shot, it's accompanying an article that talks about people that just drive down these backcountry roads and drop off animals in front of wineries, knowing that people go in and out of these wineries all the time. Okay? So, a couple of other outtakes. Full sun. I live in a sun-drenched world. I can't afford to wait until the sky turns turquoise blue. I just have to go out and underexpose it a bit and get that really nice saturated sky. The camera would have blown this sky out to smithereens. Very simple 2-light setup. Remember how I said if you want to create some interesting light, put 2 light sources right at each other and put your subject right in the middle? It's exactly what I did. I have my master speed light on the stand on the left, connected the camera with a cord. It's controlling the slave. We're firing the whole thing in high-speed sync, so I'm underexposing the ambient, okay? And that's, of course, Buster's manager there coming out to say, hey, you're doing great. Just hang with it. We'll be done here in just a moment. All right, so there's the lighting diagram. All right, so Waterboy, it's my son Tony. The shot on the left is the shot I had in my picture when I started. The shot on the right was one of the 2 hero shots from the day. It was a 118-degree day in Paso Robles, and I had this idea of doing this demonstration of backlighting in the afternoon with high-speed sync, and we just put this like lawn sprinkler curtain of water behind Tony, and it would look like little crystals in the air. Okay, we got that hero shot, and then as I walked over to Tony's oldest brother, Tom, and I said, okay, when I give you I want you to take the thing off the hose and like hit Tony straight in the head with it. Now keep in mind, it was 118 degrees. That's in the shade. We've been in the sun for 25 minutes. That's like 142 million degrees on us, okay? So Tony gives it up, and he didn't have to work really hard to get that expression because that water was 55 degrees coming out of that hose. And after like 5 minutes, the kid has no body fat because he's a little athlete and he's standing there like totally shivering it out. So a couple things I want to point out here. Thinking about the lighting compass, all right? So the image on the left, the sun is behind Tony, and the image on the right, the sun is basically behind me. It's hitting Tony flat. So I really believe in going right to the edge. I love the fact that on the left-hand image, the sun's giving me that rim light and that shoulder light very nicely. That's totally lacking in the image on the right. I'll come back in with my speed lights and I'll fill flash and create some really interesting light. So I created that shot of Tony with 3 speed lights, 2 on very high stands raked steeply down. And one of the keys to getting off-camera speed lights to work with that built-in slave system, that built-in wireless system under the sun, is just to turn the sensor of that slave speed light away from the sun. So Canonistas, that sensor is under the black panel on the front of your speed lights. That big red Cylon thing on the front, that's the autofocus assist light. It's the little black panel on top of it that's really important. Nikonians, that little symbol, that little black dot on the right side of your speed lights is the slave sensor. So these systems work great outdoors under full sun as long as you turn the slave sensor away from the sun and then position the master speed light at a spot where both slaves, or all the slaves, if it's more than 2, can see the master. Okay?
I thought the sun was behind us.
The sun is behind Tony. So, all right, so the sun is that way. Okay, it's at the back of the room. You're Tony. So the sun's coming this way. I've got slaves going like this. The front of them, I had to literally turn them around 180 degrees. So the slaves are looking away from the sun. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, just want to be sure. No speed lighter gets left behind. All right, quickly, and this will probably be the last shoot we look at so we can talk about some questions. Again, high-speed sync, very powerful tool if you shoot in the sun. Skateboarder, what do you notice? What's that big fiery orb in the upper left-hand corner? It's the sun, right? Okay, space shuttle. It's the one good thought I had last year. All right, so here we go. We've got to add fill flash, right? All right, so how do we do that? Another shot from this guy who just kept going up over this wall and up over this wall. I'm shooting a 17 millimeter lens. He's literally flying over my head. So I'm kind of doing one of these things, like making sure that he is flying over my head and not into my head. So here's the set shot as well. So 3 speed lights. The one on the stand on the right-hand side is the master. The other 2 are the slaves, are running the whole system, dimming the ambient. The key point here is, again, thematically, the key point is I'm controlling the ambient light from the get-go with my shutter, and then I'm using flash power and modifiers and flash position to create light on my subject separately, okay? It's not rocket science, but it's powerful concept in terms of how to create cinematic or pictorial light on your subject. Of course, there I am upside down with a skateboarder. All right, we've already looked at the Falconer. Can we turn on the house lights?
I have a question.
We're going to answer a question about something that was just up on the screen, or
Yeah.
Okay. Go.
The skateboarder.
Yep.
We go back to when it's close up.
That one or the one?
The one with the sun. Now I tried to shoot a picture just as such, but I was getting the sun was bleeding into that shot. It had sun
Okay.
Just high speeds.
Why did you knock that out?
All right. So I'm shooting at. I don't know why you had sun flare and I didn't. Because obviously the sun is completely within a lens hood isn't going to do anything in this shot. I'm shooting at a relatively wide aperture and a super fast shutter speed. Okay, you can create, if you want to create a nice sunburst, you go to a tiny aperture, and I was shooting Canon 1740 zoom, so also I know I'm no expert on this area at all. I know that the optics in terms of the number of elements and the coatings and all that have to do with the interior reflections, and that's what those sunspots are.
Do you know how many blades in the diaphragm on that?
What's that?
Do you know how many blades in the diaphragm in that lens?
I'm lucky to know how to mount it, but right. In terms of blades, I don't know. It's not as many as some other lenses, I know, because of its, yeah. So
What lens were you using?
this was Canon 1740. See, you guys are all way smarter than I am. I'm the guy who goes and points his camera straight at the sun.
1740 FX?
It's the 1740 that has the red band, 1740L, F4L. Okay. Go back to the diagram on this one. All right, hold on. I got to think about which button to push. Okay, this one, that one. You want to know about the handsome guy on the skateboard? Is that your question? No. All right. Is that what you wanted to see was the diagram?
Yeah.
That's all right. That's it? That's all you need?
Also, I would say take off your filter and
Right.
make sure your lens is very clean.
Right. I don't use filters on my lenses anymore, and I give them the old shirt grind before we go. I wear nice, 100% Pima cotton shirts just for that purpose. Somebody wanted to see the dog shoot again, but you want to go ahead and ask a question, ma'am?
Yeah, but it's somewhat tangential, so if.
I'm good on tangents. They
Okay,
just,
good.
all right.
In my camera, if I don't, I can't crop. I keep it cropped, so I have to put it on the computer.
Okay.
But can I, when I enlarge on the camera before it goes into the computer, can I freeze that enlargement so I don't have to go back to the original picture? That's the tangent.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think so, but I try to do as little manipulation in my camera as I can. I do everything I can to make a good capture. I shoot everything, 100% of what I shoot.
You lose the playfulness and you lose the ability to make it more flexible when you don't experiment. And what I'm asking, this is what my head is
Okay.
trying to
Sure.
throw out to you, is I have an enlarge wheel.
Okay.
on the camera. And if I like the enlargement better than the original picture, can I freeze the enlargement?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I get your point. In my world, I would go back and do it on my computer, but you're saying I don't want to do that on my computer. I get that point. Okay, question.
Why does it say that your master is disabled?
Okay. So that's a great question. When we're shooting multiple light systems, the idea of a master being enabled or disabled has to do with whether the master fires when the shutter is open or whether it just sends the instructions to the slaves and then when the shutter's open, it remains dark. So that's an important point. If your master is, as most people do it, put it in the hot shoe. Because if we have a flash in the hot shoe that fires while the shutter's open, it's creating on-camera flash, which can be helpful at low doses, low power, fill flash. So enabled and disabled, it's not as big an issue on these long cables, but when it's on camera for sure, we don't want to enable the master unless we keep it at a very low power. Great question.
So it's basically not being a part of the exposure of the light.
Right. It's using the pre-flashes of like the Morse code kicked out super fast, and it doesn't necessarily look like a separate flash from the real deal. Question. Oh, sorry.
You would use the Canon makes
The STE2 controller, I'm not a fan. And if you want to read all the gory details about why, on my blog, speedlighting.com, I talk about it there. Suffice it to say that outdoors in full sun, it oftentimes does not work because there's just a small flash tube in there. And they hide that flash tube behind a thick panel of red plastic to suck out all the visible light and just leave the infrared. Okay? So compared to the heat signature that comes off of a 580EX as a master, I'm able to get a lot more range with those. Plus, and this is a huge issue in my world, STE2 was introduced 18 years ago and does not have the technology in it that allows me to control the STE2 from the LCD of my camera. So I can take a 580EX2, and if for those who weren't here this morning, I'll be happy for a few minutes to demo that. But I'm very big on the ability to pull up the menu system for my speed light on the back of my camera, even though that speed light is stuffed inside a softbox that's 12 feet away from me. Okay, Canon has that ability. Nikon doesn't have it yet. And what's that?
It does?
You can't change from ITTL to manual on the back of your camera.
You could.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, I need a quick crash course on that because I'm being a misanthrope then. So.
7,000.
Okay. Okay. So I'd like to learn that. If you guys have some gear, we can hopefully get the crash course for me. Okay. Question.
Now let's say with the skateboarder and any other photo, when you need to really take out the ambient light or make the sky dark, do you go manual on your camera and then TTL on the flash?
Great question. So in this case, I was manual throughout the system. Okay. At least that's my recollection. So manual for sure on the shutter and on the camera, because if I'm shooting aperture priority on my 5D Mark II, I've got 3 stops plus or minus of exposure compensation. And in order to keep it consistent, because the camera's seen something different each and every time, and yet the sun's distance from us is not changing, I lock everything down in manual camera mode. As for whether I'm shooting in ETTL or manual, in this situation, it's kind of split. Because while the subject is moving, and he was definitely hitting that ramp at different angles every time, the subject of flash distance is relatively fixed, and so manual flash works in this situation. I wonder if I say in my notes. Nope.
Are you shooting multiple shots per
No, per jump. It was 1 shot per jump because you can't get the speed lights. They're basically firing at full power in high-speed sync, and they're going to take several seconds to recharge. If I'd bolted on external battery packs, I could have gotten a relatively quick speed light, but you really sometimes have to work it out of that decisive moment and wait and get that. So there were a handful of good shots and lots of crappy shots where I was too early or too late. Yeah?
As far as focus, were you using manual too?
I was locked down, absolutely. I was shooting a wide lens. So, it's kind of distorted because I'm probably at the 17 end of that zoom lens. So his hand is like a foot from the lens. Here, he's literally like 8 to 10 inches, his hand is.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, thank you for calling me out on that. So basically, was I in manual focus? And the answer is yes. I was in manual focus because I was shooting on a wide angle lens, which inherently has more depth of field than a longer focal length. So in this case, because of that lens, his hand is like less than a foot away from the lens.
Yeah, I got the same lens. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Yeah, I know.
So manual focus and basically just trying to make it, I had a piece of gaff on the other side of that ramp that was his target to fly. And so ideally, he's a pro skater, so he was hitting that pretty consistently. And then I was changing the frame a little bit.
Did you get him to smile?
That is his smile. That's a skater's smile. So, all right. Any other questions? Yep.
Silly question. You ever gone to painting with lights? Have you gone this far?
Oh yeah. Have I ever gone to painting with flash? Yeah, I have made a couple trips out to Joshua Tree National Park to paint the Joshua trees with strobe lights. You can do it with flashlights as well, but what sense would it make for a speedlighter to use a flashlight? 12,000 pops out of a 580EX with gels.
Try a locomotive sometime.
There you go.
What your rail fans would do.
Oh, cool.
It used to be with flash bulbs.
Yeah.
Until they ran away.
Right. There's the Horseshoe Bend, famous Horseshoe Bend photograph. I've seen that one. All right. Any other questions? Great. Well, hey, thank you very much.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.